The sacred hours between midnight and dawn have long been recognized by mystics and spiritual seekers as the most potent time for communion with the divine. Yet in our modern age of electric illumination and endless digital stimulation, we have forgotten the profound spiritual significance of these precious hours, particularly the mystical threshold of 3 a.m. What I am about to share with you may seem alarming, even frightening to some, but it is a truth that has been whispered among the highest initiates for millennia. There are certain practices, certain states of consciousness, certain spiritual missteps that, if engaged in during the sacred hour of 3 a.m., can permanently seal the third eye and sever one's connection to higher realms of consciousness. The third eye, that luminous center of spiritual perception located between the eyebrows, is not merely a metaphorical concept but a very real spiritual organ that serves as our gateway to cosmic consciousness. In the ancient Sanskrit texts, it is known as the Agya Chakra, the command center of spiritual vision. When properly awakened and maintained, this divine eye allows us to perceive beyond the veil of Maya, to witness the subtle energies that animate all creation, and to commune directly with the cosmic intelligence that governs the universe. But like any delicate instrument, it requires careful cultivation and protection, especially during those vulnerable hours when the veil between dimensions grows thin. At 3 a.m., the Earth's magnetic field reaches a unique configuration that creates what the ancient rishis called the hour of spiritual vulnerability. During this time, the astral plane draws closer to the physical realm, and the boundaries between conscious and unconscious states become permeable. It is precisely because of this heightened sensitivity that 3 a.m. has been traditionally reserved for the deepest meditation practices, for communion with departed souls, and for the most advanced spiritual work. The great masters of India would often rise at this hour to perform their most sacred rituals, knowing that the cosmic forces were aligned to support profound spiritual transformation. However, this same sensitivity that makes 3 a.m. so powerful for spiritual advancement also makes it extraordinarily dangerous for certain activities. The third eye, being in a state of heightened receptivity during these hours, becomes vulnerable to influences that can cause it to contract, dim, or in the most severe cases, close permanently. This is not a temporary setback that can be remedied with a few days of meditation, but a spiritual catastrophe that can persist across multiple lifetimes, cutting the soul off from its divine inheritance and condemning it to wander in spiritual darkness. The most dangerous practice to engage in at 3 a.m. is what I call forced psychic opening, the attempt to artificially stimulate the third eye through intense concentration, visualization, or breathing techniques without proper preparation or guidance. Many modern seekers, impatient for spiritual experiences and lacking the wisdom of traditional training, attempt to force open their spiritual vision through sheer willpower. They sit in meditation at 3 a.m., pressing their attention forcefully against the point between the eyebrows, visualizing brilliant lights, or performing rapid breathing exercises designed to activate the Kundalini energy. What they do not understand is that the third eye, like a delicate flower, must be coaxed open gradually through years of patient cultivation. When forced open during the vulnerable hours of early morning, it can suffer what the ancient texts describe as spiritual shock, a traumatic closing that may never be reversed. The mechanism behind this phenomenon lies in the subtle interplay between the nervous system, the astral body, and the cosmic forces that govern spiritual perception. At 3 a.m., the pineal gland, which serves as the physical anchor for the third eye, enters a state of heightened activity. The production of certain neurochemicals increases, the electromagnetic field around the head intensifies, and the entire subtle nervous system becomes extraordinarily sensitive to both beneficial and harmful influences. When a practitioner attempts to force spiritual experiences during this time, they create what can only be described as a spiritual short circuit, an overload of energy that damages the delicate mechanisms of higher perception. I have witnessed this tragedy countless times in my years of teaching. Eager students, having read about the powers of the third eye in popular books or having heard exaggerated accounts of mystical experiences, would attempt advanced practices without proper preparation. They would sit in meditation at 3 a.m., straining to see lights or visions, pushing their consciousness beyond its natural limits. The immediate result might seem positive. They might indeed experience flashes of light, strange sensations, or even brief glimpses of subtle realms. But these forced experiences come at a terrible cost. Within days or weeks, they would report that their meditation had become dry and lifeless, that the sense of spiritual presence they once felt had vanished, and that their capacity for higher perception had mysteriously disappeared. The ancient yogic texts speak of this condition as drishti-nash, the destruction of spiritual sight. Once the third eye has been traumatically closed through forced practices at 3 a.m., the individual may continue to meditate for years or even decades without ever again experiencing the profound states of consciousness that were once accessible to them. They become like spiritual invalids, going through the motions of practice but cut off from the very experiences that make spiritual life meaningful and transformative. But forced psychic opening is not the only danger that lurks in the sacred hours of early morning. Equally perilous is the practice of what modern seekers call astral projection, or out-of-body experiences attempted at 3 a.m. During these vulnerable hours, when the astral plane draws close to the physical realm, attempts to separate the subtle body from the physical form can result in what the ancient masters called soul fragmentation, a condition in which parts of the consciousness become trapped in lower astral realms, unable to return to their proper place in the spiritual anatomy. The third eye serves not only as an organ of perception, but also as a protective gateway that regulates the flow of consciousness between different planes of existence. When functioning properly, it allows the soul to explore higher realms while maintaining a secure connection to the physical body. But when damaged through improper practices at 3 a.m., this protective function is compromised. The individual may find themselves vulnerable to psychic attacks, possession by discarnate entities, or simply lost in the maze of lower astral planes with no clear path back to normal consciousness. I recall a particularly tragic case of a young man who came to me after months of attempting astral projection at 3 a.m. He had read in popular occult literature that this was the optimal time for such practices, not understanding the profound dangers involved. Night after night, he would lie in bed at 3 a.m., using various techniques to separate his consciousness from his physical form. Initially, he experienced what seemed like success, sensations of floating, glimpses of his room from above, and even apparent journeys to distant locations. But gradually, he began to notice disturbing changes in his spiritual condition. His meditation became agitated and fearful. He began to sense malevolent presences around him. Most alarming of all, his third eye, which had once been a source of peaceful inner light during meditation, became completely dark and unresponsive. When he finally sought my guidance, I could see immediately what had occurred. his repeated attempts at astral projection during the vulnerable hours of 3 a.m. had created tears in his subtle body, gaps in his spiritual anatomy through which lower astral entities could enter and through which his own consciousness could leak away. The third eye, overwhelmed by these chaotic influences and unable to maintain its protective function, had simply shut down as a defense mechanism. The healing process required months of careful work to repair the damage to his subtle body and gradually coax the third eye back into healthy function. Another practice that poses extreme danger when performed at 3 a.m. is the invocation of spiritual entities or guides without proper protection and preparation. The hours around 3 a.m. are known in occult circles as the witching hour precisely because the veil between dimensions is at its thinnest. While this can facilitate genuine communion with elevated beings and departed masters, it also makes the practitioner vulnerable to contact with entities from the lower astral planes, beings that may masquerade as spiritual guides but whose true nature is parasitic and destructive. The third eye, in its role as the organ of spiritual discernment, normally allows the practitioner to distinguish between beneficial and harmful spiritual influences. But at 3 a.m., when this faculty is in a state of heightened sensitivity, it can become overwhelmed by the intensity of astral contact and lose its discriminating power. Practitioners who attempt to channel spirits, communicate with deceased relatives, or invoke spiritual guides during these hours often find themselves in contact with entities that claim to be enlightened masters but whose influence gradually undermines their spiritual progress and mental stability. The damage to the third eye in such cases occurs through what can be described as spiritual contamination. Lower astral entities carry with them vibrations of fear, confusion, and spiritual darkness. When these influences enter the practitioner's consciousness through unprotected psychic contact at 3 a.m., they can literally poison the subtle mechanisms of higher perception. The third eye, designed to perceive the pure light of divine consciousness, becomes clouded and eventually closes when repeatedly exposed to these corrupting influences. Even seemingly innocent practices can become dangerous when performed at the vulnerable hour of 3 a.m. The use of divination tools such as tarot cards, crystal balls, or pendulums during these hours can open channels of communication with unpredictable forces. The practice of automatic writing, allowing one's hand to be guided by unseen influences to produce written messages, becomes particularly hazardous at 3 a.m. when the practitioner's normal conscious control is at its weakest. Even the simple act of gazing into mirrors or reflective surfaces during these hours can create openings for unwanted spiritual contact, as mirrors have long been recognized as portals between dimensions. The tragedy of third eye closure is compounded by the fact that most practitioners do not immediately recognize what has occurred. The closing of this spiritual faculty is often gradual, and the individual may attribute their diminishing spiritual experiences to temporary factors such as stress, illness, or lack of practice. They may continue their spiritual routines for months or years, wondering why their meditation has become dry and lifeless, why they no longer feel the presence of the divine, why their intuitive abilities have seemingly vanished. Only when they encounter a teacher with the spiritual vision to diagnose their condition do they realize the magnitude of what has been lost. The prevention of this spiritual catastrophe requires both knowledge and discipline. First and foremost, practitioners must understand that 3 a.m. is not a time for experimental or aggressive spiritual practices. This sacred hour should be reserved for gentle, traditional forms of meditation that have been tested and refined over centuries of use. The simple practice of focusing on the breath, repeating a sacred mantra, or offering devotional prayers are safe and beneficial activities that can be performed at any hour without risk to the third eye. For those who feel called to practice at 3 a.m., the approach must be one of humble receptivity rather than forceful seeking. Instead of trying to create spiritual experiences, the practitioner should simply sit in quiet meditation, offering themselves as an empty vessel for divine grace. The third eye should never be directly stimulated or forced during these vulnerable hours. Instead, attention should be gently focused on the heart center, allowing any natural opening of higher perception to occur spontaneously and safely. The protection of the third eye also requires careful attention to one's overall spiritual hygiene. Regular practice of pranayama breathing exercises during safe hours helps to strengthen the subtle nervous system and build resilience against harmful influences. The cultivation of devotion and surrender to the divine creates a protective aura that shields the practitioner from lower astral entities. Most importantly, the guidance of a qualified teacher who understands the dangers and can provide proper instruction is essential for anyone serious about spiritual development. The ancient masters developed elaborate systems of spiritual protection precisely because they understood the very real dangers that face the unprepared seeker. These protective practices include the visualization of divine light surrounding the body, the repetition of specific mantras that create barriers against harmful influences, and the cultivation of certain mental attitudes that naturally repel lower astral entities. Such protections become absolutely crucial for anyone who chooses to engage in spiritual practice during the vulnerable hours of early morning. For those who have already suffered damage to their third eye through improper practices at 3 a.m., healing is possible but requires patience, proper guidance, and often years of careful remedial work. The process typically begins with a complete cessation of all advanced spiritual practices and a return to the most basic forms of meditation and prayer. The damaged spiritual faculties must be allowed to rest and recover, much like a physical injury requires time to heal. Gradually, under proper guidance, gentle practices can be reintroduced to slowly rebuild the capacity for higher perception. This might include simple breathing exercises, devotional chanting, and meditation on the heart center rather than the third eye itself. The healing process is often accompanied by periods of spiritual dryness and discouragement, as the practitioner must rebuild their connection to the divine from the ground up. The ultimate lesson in all of this is that spiritual development, like any other form of growth, must proceed according to natural laws and rhythms. The third eye is not a toy to be played with or a tool to be forced into service, but a sacred faculty that must be approached with reverence, patience, and proper understanding. The hours around 3 a.m., far from being a time for spiritual experimentation, should be treated as a sacred sanctuary where only the most gentle and traditional practices are appropriate. In our modern age of instant gratification and technological solutions, it is tempting to believe that spiritual development can be accelerated through force of will or clever techniques. But the ancient wisdom reminds us that the most profound spiritual treasures can only be received as gifts of grace, and that the attempt to seize them through force inevitably leads to spiritual impoverishment. The third eye, that precious gateway to cosmic consciousness, must be protected and nurtured with the same care we would give to the most delicate and valuable treasure, for indeed, that is exactly what it is. Let this serve as both warning and guidance for all sincere seekers on the spiritual path. The hour of 3 a.m. holds great power for those who approach it with wisdom and humility, but it can become a source of lasting spiritual damage for those who venture into its mysteries unprepared. Guard well your third eye, for once closed through improper practice, it may remain sealed for lifetimes to come, leaving the soul to wander in darkness when it might have soared in the light of divine consciousness.